The Secret Library podcast is brought to you by listeners like you through the Secret Library podcast Patreon, which you can find at patreon.com/secretlibrary. This is episode 117 of the Secret Library podcast. My guest this week is Joanna Penn. She is an award-nominated New York Times and USA Today bestselling author of thrillers under J.F. Penn, and she also writes nonfiction for authors under Joanna Penn. She's an award-winning entrepreneur, podcaster, and YouTuber. Her site, thecreativepenn.com, has been voted in the top 100 sites for writers by Writer's Digest. So those of you who are regular listeners to the show will remember that Joanna Penn has been on the show before. She was one of the most popular episodes we've had, partly because she is so great at giving practical, thoughtful advice to writers. And I wanted to have her back because of her recent book, How to Write Nonfiction. And writing nonfiction and sharing nonfiction books and selling nonfiction books as well has been a topic of interest that I think we haven't gone into as deeply as we could on the show. So for anyone who's looking to write a nonfiction book and who wants to share information that you've learned, share your expertise, maybe expand your reach in a business that you have or in trying to get out there as a speaker. And if you have a desire, much like on a previous episode with Chris Guillebeau and Tom Hodgkinson, to build a business around your writing life, you'll want to have a nonfiction book eventually. And so I wanted to have Joanna back on to talk about how to write that book and how to write it really well so that it's a rewarding experience for you, your reader, and whatever goals you have for the book. So here we go with an amazing conversation, as always, with Joanna Penn. Hi, Joanna. Thanks so much for coming back on.
Oh, thanks so much, Caroline. It's great to be here.
I love a repeat guest. It's super fun because I'm like, oh, we can just get right into it.
Yeah, we know each other now. We can just be honest, and not that we weren't honest last time, but
there is that like edging thing. Plus, I always love having people on who have shows because I know how nice it is to be the guest because it's like, I don't have to plan anything. But then I also like I know you're going to answer well. I don't know. Everyone's like, great. Yes, you're having a love fest. Move on, people. So you've had so many books come out that are super useful, but in particular, How to Write Nonfiction is now out. And it was so cute to see you with your Facebook Live bravery with everybody typing in and saying what bestseller list it was hitting while you were on there. And so first of all, congratulations on how well the book is doing.
Oh, thank you so much. And it is, you did say bravery there. I mean, we are in inverted commas live now, like you and me, but I know this can be edited. And Facebook Live just fills me with fear for some reason, because you know that if you make a mistake, like people are watching you live, and that's just kind of scary. And it's the first time I've done it for a book launch. So, and that's after, 10 years of putting books out. So if people listening are like, oh my goodness, I could never do that. Well, it might take 10 years, but eventually you might get to it. And as you say, what's so interesting as writers is so often it's like telepathy, right? I'm writing something now, and in next year or something it will appear in someone else's brain. But with the live thing, people are actually giving you feedback straight away. So I definitely want to hold on to the bravery and do it for my next book launch too. But that was fun.
I have to say, well, we'll link to because you can see it later, and it is an episode an in-between episode, as we say, in your podcast now. So everyone listening can listen to that episode, and you may have the same reaction I had, which was, this can't possibly be the first time you're doing this, because you sound so natural doing it.
Well, I had done a couple of years ago, and just kind of got scared. Again, the introvert thing. I don't know whether it's introvert actually, but just maybe being prepared. We're good girls. Or at least on the surface, right. We like to prepare, to have the questions ready, to have thought about our answers so we can be semi-coherent. And I think, and also maybe that's just part of being a writer. we know that with writing, the first draft is the first draft, so no one's going to see that. So the first thing that comes out of our brains is not usually the most coherent thing, but then after the editing and everything, you can make it sound very intelligent, as per everyone on your podcast. But yes, and also I guess I would also encourage people to try this stuff. Whatever is out of your comfort zone. So I'll tell you something I have never done. I have never read my fiction out loud in public. That just scares me stupid. But I've spoken all over the world to thousands of people on the non-fiction topic. So maybe we'll cover that today, like the difference between fiction and non-fiction. But yeah, this book, How to Write Nonfiction, was very much something that I finally decided to put together. You write what you want to get straight in your brain. And I know I needed to get that straight in my brain.
Yes. Well, first of all, I have to say, as a little aside, that this makes me want to bring you on for one of your fiction releases and have you read it over the podcast.
That'll be a no.
Maybe if we involve gin and tonic. But to get into, I think what you said, the difference between fiction and nonfiction, I think is critical. And also getting things straight in your brain. One of the things you talk about in How to Write About Nonfiction is starting with the table of contents, which I thought was really helpful to get the topic straight in your brain. And I'm wondering if we could go through how you think about deciding on an idea for what you're going to write a nonfiction book about, and then go step by step through the early process, maybe the lead up to the writing process, so that everyone can see how that works.
Yeah, sure. Well, straight up, I think there are two directions that you can do a nonfiction book from. So there's the top-down approach, or the kind of bottom-up approach. So the top-down approach is, and I've talked about this to you, I want to write a book on the shadow, about writing from the dark side. This is a topic I am interested in. So, the topic is the shadow and creativity from the dark. I want to write it, I will research it, and eventually I'll come up with a table of contents. But it's stemming from myself, my interest, the things I want to do. The kind of the bottom-up approach is often when you have an audience and you notice that something is resonating with your audience, and you go from there. And this, for many nonfiction writers, they already have some kind of a job or business, or a community. I know you've had the Being Boss ladies, for example. That's a great example of a sort of bottom-up community thing meets top-down. So for me, the successful author mindset is probably the most obvious one, which is really about the psychology of the roller coaster ride of creativity. And I did a blog post on that, and it resonated so much that I was like, oh, this needs to be a book. So either of those angles are completely valid. So either you just have a book of your heart, you're really interested in this topic, or it kind of bubbles up from the people who you serve, your community. And then in terms of the kind of again, there's kind of two ways. One, if you have an existing amount of material. So, if you have lots of stuff already, like a blog or a podcast or an email series that you can turn into a book, that's one way to start. You have that material. Often those people will struggle because there might be too much. So for those people, I say get 1 page of A4 paper and write down as the most important things. And once you've filled 1 piece of paper, that's it. That's all you're getting for your table of contents. And the other direction, if you're doing it kind of from the top down, is to just brainstorm from your interest. So for example, with the writing from the shadow, I know, one of my line items, I guess, on the table of contents will be Carl Jung and what is the shadow, for example, or Plato's Chariot, how to merge the dark and the light side. Those types of, or, horror would be, why do people write violence? Why do people write sex? These are kind of crazy questions for creatives, because of course we do. But, how do you tap into that? So those are the kind of two angles that you can come from with nonfiction books. But a lot of that is also to do with research and the metaphor of the creative pipe. I know Julia Cameron has the creative well, but I kind of think of it as a pipe, which is you have to put stuff in the top for stuff to come out the bottom kind of transformed. So you have to do your research, you have to fill your brain with all kinds of different stuff so that you can come up with an original take on what is probably a topic that lots of people have written about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that really clarifies, yes, it's okay to have a book that is an ongoing thing that you're thinking about, like the shadow book. And I kind of love the idea of just sort of setting things in either a digital or a physical folder, or I love how you talk about using Pinterest for your novels and keeping boards to sort of keep you inspired, that whatever kind of takes you. So one thing I want to ask about, because this is a problem I'm having at the moment, is that you seem to have no shortage of ideas and options. And not only that, you have now 3 names that you're writing under. So, and they span all the way from sweet romance to dark thrillers to nonfiction. So how are you keeping all of this straight in your brain and even more importantly, in your writing schedule?
Well, I think that word schedule is the key. So, and I also think having different names, it's very difficult in one way because you have to have 3 different websites, 3 different email lists, 3 different brands, and which is difficult. But in another way, it's easier because I actually schedule my time by author name. So you're interviewing Joanna Penn. This morning I was, doing my writing for my next novel as JF Penn. And so it's almost, and it's not like I have any kind of psychological difficulties. It is that when I sit down as to write my thrillers, for example, I have a particular way of doing it. I go to a cafe, I put my noise cancelling headphones on, I have the sound of rain and thunderstorms, and I sink into that persona. And that persona has quite a lot in common with you in terms of the art side and the, your tarot side and the interest in these more arcane matters. That's when I get into that persona, the things that I'm reading, the things I'm putting into my brain are kind of just segmented. Those things are kept quite separate. The Penny Appleton, the sweet romance, I co-write with my mum, and that's not something I ever thought I would do. But actually, I've done a lot more co-writing in the last few years, and it's a fascinating process. You learn a lot by co-writing, especially with a more junior writer, which is terrible to say about my mum, but is actually true. And then with the nonfiction, as I said, my nonfiction is usually of service to my community. And although I benefit greatly because I learn a lot from what I'm writing, it also obviously does make money, which benefits me, but it also is to help other writers like yourself who are writing nonfiction. So it's like, here are the things I've learned and hopefully it will help you. Whereas with my fiction, I really feel like I'm being selfish in a way, and it's really weird. I was talking to Stephen Pressfield, who wrote The War of Art, yesterday. He's on my show, and I was saying, I said to him, I asked him this question because he writes fiction and nonfiction, and he talks about honouring the muse, and maybe there are 2 different muses, a different muse for fiction and a different muse for nonfiction, because they almost seem to come from different places. Now, I know you've had memoir writers on your show, as have I, and I think memoir is a bit different because it's almost a combination of fiction and non-fiction. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I wonder whether that is, and a lot of my non-fiction has my own journal entries in, my own, How to Write Nonfiction has a very personal story at the front.
Yes.
So you can share a lot of personal stuff with nonfiction, but I still feel like if you want to see into someone's brain, you read their fiction.
That is fascinating, though, because in writing groups I've been in, there is, and this has nothing to do with nonfiction, but there is this sense of these people that you meet and they have this persona, and then you read their fiction and you're like, oh, I had no idea that was in there.
Well, exactly. And it's funny because I'm pretty obsessed with self-censorship and trying to help people around that, because I feel, like I said earlier, you know, we're nice girls with these nice jolly voices, and yet some of the stuff I write is very, very dark. And, you know, I'm kind of, I call myself a vanilla goth. I don't look like a goth, but you know, I should be. In my mind, I'm covered in tattoos and I'm wearing like, you know, I have goth makeup, and I go to Day of the Dead, and I hang out in the catacombs like a vampire. And so, but that's not my. I have this other self-help side, which wants to be Tony Robbins. So you kind of meet vampire meets Tony Robbins type of personality. But what's awesome about the way we can live now, the careers we have, is that we can do all these different types of things. You can indulge all those parts of your personality, and there is a place for them. That, you know, I can co-write a sweet romance that has a happy ending and nobody dies, which is just not what happens in my thrillers.
No, not at all. So you have, I mean, you're writing in series, essentially, because the nonfiction is all under the, you know, books for authors sort of category. And it isn't the same as in you need to know what happened in the one before in order to be caught up for the next one, the way it is with fiction. But you are kind of building this catalog in the Penny Appleton world, in the J.F. Penn world, which is absolutely a series. And then you've written other fiction series. And then the how-to author books. How are you kind of timing them in your head? Because on your show, you say things like, okay, my next book up is a fiction book, so I'm going to be working on that one. How are you timing how many books you want to get out a year and balancing when you go back from nonfiction and fiction?
I wish I could say I was super organized and had a production schedule. I have a daily schedule which has time blocks for creation. But what I have been unable to do because of the muse, I will blame it on the muse. I can't seem to schedule the books I'm going to write. So it really is. I didn't even know I was going to write this How to Write Nonfiction this year. I literally did not know that was what was coming up. But I thought I would just write a little short book because people kept asking me these questions, and then it just turned into quite a big, it's a chunky book, you know, it's like 65,000 words or something. And then with my fiction, well, I tend to alternate. So I do kind of go, you know, novel, novella, nonfiction, novel, nonfiction, you know, kind of like that. But with the fiction, I was getting desperate. I think everyone who writes recognizes that feeling when you're, oh my goodness, I am so done with this project. I really want a new project. Yeah. And I've had this story bubbling away in my mind. I went to San Francisco, or I went to New Orleans 2 years ago and San Francisco last year. And I knew I needed to write an Arcane. And Arcane is one of my series thriller about America. And so I've had one set in New York, but when I was like in New Orleans, I was like, oh my goodness, this is so European. And I was in the St. Louis Cathedral, and there's a Bible there, which the original Bible is in Toledo in Spain. And so I just needed an excuse to go to Toledo in Spain. So I was there a couple of weeks ago, and with the aim, it was a kind of it was a double thing. It was I am done with this nonfiction book and I am ready for my next novel. So I go places looking for story, and I went there looking for whatever I could find. I went to look at the Bible, but found stuff in Madrid. And so now that story is formed in my head that's been kind of marinating for a couple of years, even though I've written other novels since then. And now I'm ready to write that book. So for me, it is very much what comes up in the moment. And I don't really know how many books I will necessarily write in a year. I certainly will expect to at least write one fiction or two fiction and one nonfiction. That certainly would be an aim at the beginning of the year. But as to which one, it really is what moves me enough to sit down and do that project.
I love that, because in my head, you're so organized, and on your show you have okay, this is how the last year went, and here are my goals for this upcoming year. And I had this vision of this spreadsheet of, here's the pipeline for the next 7 books or whatever sitting there.
I would love to say I do that, but I think what I am, as I said, I'm organized on a day-to-day basis. And if you schedule time slots for the author names or for creation projects, that is how you get stuff done. So if you make time for it and show up, it will happen, whatever is going to show up, and I think it's amusing because of course I do record podcasts at the beginning of every year and the end when I talk about how the year went and then my goals for the following year. What is hilarious is a lot of what I set out to achieve doesn't happen, but a whole load of other stuff happens. So, what do you say? I mean, I wrote a script early this year. I put out so many books last year. I got really exhausted and burned out around books, like the book product. So I wrote a script February, March this year. I wrote a feature, and that completely refreshed me, but I didn't intend to do that at all. So sometimes you just have to lean into it,
I love that. So I want to talk a little bit more about, so you've got your idea. You may not have scheduled it in advance, but an idea has presented itself. And I'm particularly fond of this phenomenon where you write a blog post, which, by the way, everyone, blogging is still clearly extremely valid for a number of reasons, which Joanna does talk about in her books. But you've somehow interacted with an audience or a community, and people are really responding to something. And then the idea is to turn it into a book, to expand it. So I want to come at this from two sides. One is you've got something like a blog post that's fairly condensed, and you want to expand it. And then maybe we can go from the other end that you mentioned earlier, that somebody has a lot of material and maybe they want to condense it. So can we start with the blog post and how you go about picking that apart and making it a larger manuscript?
Right. Well, yeah. And usually, well, for me, it was literally a blog post about the roller coaster of the creative life. And, it was all about the binary relationship. So the first line was, I love writing. It's the best thing. I feel fulfilled when I write. And then I hate writing. It drives me crazy. It takes everything out of me. And it was all about that. And it was, I want to be famous. I want to make millions. And then I just want to be left alone to write in my cave. So this was it was only 200 words. But I think the key with blog posts that stand out like that is they have emotion in them. And so that would be my first tip, would be whatever, I bet you, if a blog post does resonate, there is some form of emotion in it and some form of deep personal story. And I think this is what happened with the How to Write Nonfiction. I thought I was going to write a little self-help book that would be, really short, bit of a how-to. And then it turned out that it ended up with a lot more heart in than I expected. And I end up kind of saying, please don't just write another throwaway nonfiction book. Please bring your heart into it. So I think that's the truth with the blog posts and the writing that we, or even things we put on social media. It's often the things with heart and human emotion that resonate. And then from there, you can expand it. So in that situation, it really was about the dichotomies and the binary sides of creativity, that then I actually expanded every single one of those sentences into chapters. So how do you feel when what's difficult about publishing a book is the creative dissatisfaction. You think it's going to be the pinnacle of your life, but it's only the start, so stuff like that, the things that happen. So that would be one tip, like really look at the emotion of whatever you've written and try and kind of figure out what it was that hit with the audience. And then you need to be thinking obviously about the topic, but also the specific target audience of your site, of your book, in the same way as like a podcast. You and I both have podcasts for writers, and they could be writers at the beginning of their journey, they could be established writers, so really thinking more specifically about who you're writing for. And then it is about expanding it. Now, I like to kind of come up with probably at the beginning 10 to 15 one-liners. I actually use Scrivener to do all my books.
The best.
Yeah, just Scrivener's amazing. And what's brilliant is you can just dump one-liners into it. You can just say, okay, I'm going to, talk about this, like I said, about the shadow book. And then from there, you expand those. I have, amusingly, I've done this for a how to write a novel. So I actually have an online course for how to write a novel. And I thought I will turn that into a book. So I got transcripts of whatever it is, 9 hours worth of lectures and things, and put them all into Scrivener. And I've ended up with 100,000 words on how to write a novel, and I can't tackle it. I know, but I can't tackle it. I look at it and it's too much. So this is the other angle. Okay, so if you are a speaker, you listening, or if you are a speaker, like turning your talks into a book can actually be quite difficult. I almost feel like I have to start again. So if you have too much, then I would almost say start again with just writing down that 15 things, and then start filling in the blanks. But if you've got a lot of material, you might end up turning that into multiple books. And that might be the key, is to really think, okay, so how does this go beyond one book? Like you say, I've got a series of nonfiction, which is lots of different things for writers from lots of different angles. And that's, it's quite common within the nonfiction niche as well, to write lots of books for the same market, because we often think about these things. So I think you can definitely do both.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing that I notice happening in myself, and I notice it in other people also, particularly with nonfiction, is that people want to put everything into the book. And I wonder if that comes from something you also talk about very well in How to Write Nonfiction, is the sort of fear of, am I enough of an expert to do this? Therefore, I'm going to put everything I know into it to sort of prove to myself as I'm writing that I'm an expert. Whereas you also talk about many times, and I agree with you, the advantage of having a series. So to me, the urge to put everything into the book could be mitigated by maybe you write a series of books on different aspects of the topic. Then you get to build authority over time. It's less overwhelming to write a slightly shorter book, and you have the advantages, which are very clear, of having a series of books for people to buy and read.
Yeah, and I think this has a lot to do with the publishing industry.
Well,
because
I'm certain of that too.
Because the publishing industry, when will not take a book proposal for 25,000 word book. Usually, the books we see on the shelves at Barnes and Noble and Amazon bookstore or whatever are usually, in the physical form, are the heavier books. They are thicker, and so they are usually between 50,000, like over 50,000 words. But what's interesting in a digital world is you don't need to write a book that's that length. So my best-selling nonfiction book is How to Make a Living with Your Writing. It's 27,000 words. It's a short book. It is available in print and also audio. It's a short book. It delivers everything it says on the tin, and I don't need to write any more in that. And if you want more, I've got a much longer book called Business for Authors. But what's so interesting, and the reason I wrote that shorter book, was because Business for Authors was not hitting the audience I wanted it to. So I wrote a shorter, more accessible book that didn't mention tax. and it sold better. And this is what's so interesting. So when you're thinking about what should I do with nonfiction, then really consider, okay, what do I want it for? So the book as business card, or the book for speakers, that's often the kind of chunkier book, or the the book deal where it is a sort of landmark book as such, is quite different to the person who has an audience, or wants to build an audience, who wants to write multiple books in a niche, who wants to build their expertise, who is very happy to make $4 per book with a digital, with an ebook, who doesn't necessarily need a massive doorstop. So these are very different ways of measuring success. But I think because the trend of writing longer padded nonfiction has persisted in the traditional publishing environment, that has meant that a lot of people have padded their books. So it would be great if we changed that. Someone like Seth Godin is a great example. He started the Domino project as a way to publish shorter books, that, basically his own publishing company, and published a whole load of short books. Stephen Pressfield, who I mentioned, has his own publishing company with his partner and his business partner, and they're doing short books. So it certainly can be done.
Yeah, it amazes me. I was thinking of Stephen Pressfield as you're talking, because I think of all of his books. None of them is a huge long book. I mean, they're very digestible, they're easy to read, and they were originally traditionally published, were they not?
Well, the first one was, but a long time ago. He's a great example of some. I mean, obviously, you can look at lots of older nonfiction was shorter, but then things became longer for whatever reason. Stephen and Sean Coyne, who has a fantastic book, The Story Grid, which I highly recommend. They have Black Irish books. They're starting to publish other people now, as well. So. Yeah, you get to choose. And Steve actually just put out, serialized his latest book, The Artist's Journey, on his blog. So there's another thing about blogs. So it's so interesting how you can go both ways with the material. And I actually do this too. I will write the book and then I'll put the blog posts on, the chapters onto my blog. So vice versa, you can bring blog posts into a book, but you can also use chapters on a blog if you own the rights, of course.
Absolutely. This is something to remember, is that the whole industry and the whole concept of writing nonfiction is fluid, and it is evolving all the time. And this is an example of things changing. I mean, the thing that I love too is the idea of using a book as a way to function as sort of an independent, standalone, and profitable FAQ.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that concept, because I think a lot of people think about, if I write a book, it's in all caps, and the idea is if I'm going to write a book, possibly in italics and underlined as well, then it has to be a big idea, and it has to be some sort of tome. I mean, I'm thinking of, Robert McKee's Story, that it's all about the whole concept,
Yeah.
But there are other ways that nonfiction books can serve both you and the reader.
Yeah, totally. And I was just thinking there of Elizabeth Gilbert. Now, her Big Magic book is fantastic, and it is quite big as well. But she does say in there, you do not have to change the world with your book. You don't have to change me with your book. In fact, I'd rather you didn't try. Just put your book out in the world and see what happens. It does. Well, I think again. The more books you write, the easier this becomes. I think it can be very difficult for people who might be approaching their first book. It's like, I need to write the book, as you say. And my first book, Career Change, which is now 10 years old, was about, finding a new career if you hate the job you're in, and, ended up changing my life, if not many other people's. But that book, when I wrote that, I really did think it was going to be the only book I ever wrote. And I took it very seriously, and I take every book seriously, but I mean, what I think we need to think nowadays is, as you say, the FAQ idea is brilliant. And one of my books, Successful Self-Publishing, another very short book, it's free on all ebook stores, because every day I get questions, how do I self-publish a book? So I'm like, okay, you can find it on my blog or just download this book. It's in print as well. And then you'll get all the answers. And just on nonfiction and money, because I know you do cover money on your show and we've talked about it before, but if you have a free ebook and that's getting downloaded every day, you can fill it with other things. So if you have a series like I do, it will sell into your other series. It will help the algorithm. People who bought this also bought that. You can put links to your courses, your other books, your consulting services. You can put affiliate links in the book. You can offer a very helpful resource that also will make you money, even if that money is not the direct book sale. So if you just relax into, this book does not have to be my magnum opus, then that will really help you. And of course, at some point, maybe you will write that magnum opus. I think for me, the shadow book, which I've been talking about for so long now, feels like a bigger book to me. But I also feel like I need to be a better writer to write a bigger book, if you know what I mean. And we're always, investigating these things about ourselves. So yeah, I think maybe relaxing a bit. And if you are writing nonfiction and serving a community, then it's a bit like professional speaking. It ain't about you, it's about them. So how can you help them? And that will help you get over your issues, probably.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing that comes up. Because as you say, I need to be a better writer to write the shadow book. I'm wondering about the people who feel like I need to be a better writer to write any book at all. And
there are editors. So that's important.
Struggle.
There are editors. What I would say just on the better writer, Ira Glass talks about that gap between who we are and who we want to be. Yeah. But this is the thing. I actually think nonfiction, and this is not meant to be offensive in any way, but nonfiction is easier to write than fiction. I think that you can write and I do really think anyone can write a nonfiction book. And in fact, the more close to the average person your writing is, the better for nonfiction, because people buy nonfiction to solve a problem or to find out about a particular topic, but usually they want to change something or they need help, and they don't need perfect, beautiful Pulitzer Prize winning writing. Neither do you have to write that if you write thrillers or whatever, but you know what I mean? It's like with nonfiction, I really think focusing on your audience and being as accessible as possible is probably a better idea. And yeah, you can use editors to help you if you're really struggling.
This is something I think about a lot too, because people write nonfiction every day. They just don't think about it that way. Like every email you write is basically writing nonfiction, and people do communicate in many ways primarily by writing. This is a texting and emailing culture that we live in now. And yet the number of times I talk to people about, well, yes, I write, and I interview writers and people say, oh, I'm not a writer.
Yeah.
And I always want to say, well, do you email or text people? In which case you do communicate with writing, and all it is expanding that and putting some structure around it and finding a topic that's useful.
Well, I think that structure point, and it kind of circles back what we were saying, the kind of table of contents, but often structure is what people struggle with nonfiction. And it's interesting, last year we did The Healthy Writer. I co-wrote that with a medical doctor, and we struggled with structure right up until our last draft. We were still trying to figure out the order of the chapters. And I think I changed it like right at the end as well. So I do get that you might have all this information either in your head or in bits and bobs of writing, but the structure of a nonfiction book can be difficult. That's why Scrivener can be so good. So if you're someone listening and you're struggling with structure, Scrivener can help you because you visualize the structure on the screen, on the pane, and then you can actually drag and drop things around. And that to me is the key with nonfiction. You will never ever write start to finish with a nonfiction book. You won't. And please don't try and write the introduction first.
Oh no, don't do that.
Will like be one of the last things you write. But the structure will emerge. I really think like the first 15 things that you write down will be a starter for 10, and then you will drag and drop things around. You'll create new things. You'll concatenate things. But I do think that a lot of people who write in Word or just write in a more in a linear way will struggle with nonfiction in terms of that structuring. So that would be a real tip for structure, because you have to take people on a journey with nonfiction in exactly the same way as you do with fiction. They have to start somewhere and end somewhere and not be confused along the way. So you do have to make sure you get everything in the right order. So yeah, I agree with you that people write nonfiction every day, but what they don't do is structure it. So I think that is critical to write a nonfiction book that satisfies your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't second enough Scrivener has been a sponsor of the show. So I will say that as a disclosure, but they were because everybody talks about how much they love it. And for anyone who's listening, I doubt there's probably 3 of you left who have not been sold on this. But to be able to write in pieces, see the whole thing, and then move things around versus writing on essentially a long spool of paper, which is how Word feels to me. And then having to go, where is that bit about that? I want to work on that bit. It is pretty revolutionary.
Yeah, and I don't know how anyone writes without it now. I mean, I don't write fiction in order either. I might write two scenes from the perspective of the antagonist, and then I want to intersperse that with, other scenes. So I drag that around, or that timeline has changed, or, so yeah, I know some people, like, I think older writers will sit down and by hand, write out beginning to end. Or maybe they're just lying, I don't know, but...
I do that.
Oh, really? From
Yes,
the beginning to the end of a book?
I mean, I write by hand because there's less critical voice coming in. So I have this weird process, which is inspired partly by something you talked about, where I will write by hand and then I transcribe it in with dictation.
I was going to mention dictation about getting rid of critical voice with that. Do you find that then?
Yes, absolutely. So I find that like my critical voice is less threatened by writing in a notebook, because then it's like, oh, she's just writing in a notebook. Nobody's going to read that. And then when I transcribe it in, I can kind of think, oh, I want to phrase that slightly differently. So that's like a first pass of editing. And then once I put the transcription into Scrivener, then I can really start saying, does this scene actually go before that scene, or does it go after it?
Wow, that's so interesting. And I mean, for anyone listening who hasn't tried dictation, you can obviously do it for nonfiction as well. And you can do it straight into the microphone. So for me, I definitely can bypass critical voice if I'm not looking at a screen. So if I'm just talking into my recorder and then transcribing it later, I think that if I'm seeing it transcribing on the screen as I talk, that just does not work.
Oh no, I can't do that either. I use a digital recorder too.
Yeah.
So it made me think earlier also when you said for someone who has a ton of material and is feeling overwhelmed but is a speaker, would you ever go through, let's say you've got a whole bunch of video, like you talked about your How to Write a Novel course. You have a whole bunch of material that's maybe been transcribed. You could maybe pull the themes to put on your sheet of paper and say, these are the themes I'm seeing that I want to talk about. But you could almost, thinking about a book later, write down the themes in order. And then if you're a natural speaker, but you're scared of writing, you could use something like Dragon and do some speaking on the topics for each chapter and then put them straight into the book.
Yes, I agree with you. And what I think I will end up doing now, I don't think it'll be my next nonfiction book, but it'll happen at sometime will be almost to go through and pick out questions. I do think that being interviewed on topics like we're doing, the sort of backwards and forwards, is people can pull stuff out of you that you might not have thought of yourself. But if you transcribe your existing talks, or if you talk about something, you'll find bits that you can then take that and then do a further session on. So you can almost go deeper every time. And a lot of us talk a lot. So that can actually be a great way to get to a first draft. But I think the other thing about structuring with nonfiction these days is almost in common with blog posts, having a lot of white space and a lot of subheadings. So, if people open a book and it's all looking more like a novel, with no subheadings on, most nonfiction doesn't look like that anymore. It actually looks like, it has quotes on, it might have questions, it might have, subheadings on this. That's certainly in the more business, self-help, health niche. I mean, maybe if it's a biography or, that might be different. But I think organizing things around questions can also help you with subheadings and the sort of substructure, which if you're feeling overwhelmed with material, that substructure can help as well.
Yeah, and I think something that you talk about in there is if you're feeling a certain way, then it's likely your reader will feel that way. You talk about it in terms of feeling bored by the topic and wanting to infuse some personal experience into it. But I think by the same token, if you look at a page and the way that it's formatted feels overwhelming, or like, oh, that's going to be hard to read through, that is likely to be the same experience for the reader. So pay attention to that and take it seriously.
And in fact, that probably is the number one overwhelming tip for writing nonfiction is think of your reader. And that sort of circles back to me saying I feel in quotation marks, selfish when writing fiction, because I don't really think about my reader when I write fiction. I'm like into the story, I'm thinking about my characters. But in writing nonfiction, you're writing it for a reader. You're writing it for somebody who you're trying to help, or you're trying to answer a question, or share a transformation with the hope of helping someone else through a transformation. So if you need to consider where they are on the journey and make sure you serve that purpose. So when I said I was bored, it's like, oh, I'm really over this. It's because I was writing chapters that felt repetitive to me because I've talked about it before, or I know it already. Whereas for somebody new reading it, it's so important that they understand that. Like, for example, the question, there is a chapter on how long does your book have to be that we've discussed. But for me to write that down in a chapter, it's like, oh goodness, do I have to talk about this again? But it's like, this is important. This is actually one of the key questions that people have every time. So you want to always keep your reader in mind and serve them with your book. And then one, it will be a better book, but two, it might sell more. Yay!
Absolutely. And one final thing to mention too, in terms of being able to separate, because there is always this feeling of like, oh, this is so boring and so obvious. Nobody's going to find this interesting, but readers will find it interesting. One tool that you've used well for this and the Healthy Writer is a survey. So don't be afraid to survey people if you have an audience and see what questions come up for them that may be perfectly obvious to you because you've done whatever you're writing the book about so many times. But to them, it's actually very crucial and useful information.
Yeah. And actually, when I did the survey for How to Write Nonfiction, it was something like 50% of people said that they had not written a book yet because they didn't feel like an expert. So that went from...
That's heartbreaking.
I know. And that's something that I had on my list, but it was way down the bottom of my list. And yet, once that happened, I moved that right to near the top of the book. Like that's like, the second chapter or something. Feeling like a fraud. Someone said, I have 30 years experience, but self-doubt stops me from writing. And this self-doubt, and it begs the question, how many PhDs do you need to be taken seriously? Or, it's kind of crazy. And what's so funny as well is once you write a book on a topic, people think you're an expert.
Exactly.
So it's
the cure is writing the book, not...
Exactly.
You don't need to have the qualifications to write the book. The book will give you the qualifications.
Yeah. And it's so interesting that is the most... I think that's probably pretty common with novelists too. I mean, that, how can I write a book? I've never written a book. And it's like, well, you kind of have to just get going. But yeah, I mean, if people are feeling that, if they're feeling like they're not an expert, it really is like coming back to that personal experience. Wherever you are on the journey, you can help people. We mentioned Stephen Pressfield. I'm not Stephen Pressfield. I'm not, I haven't been writing for the last 50 years or whatever, how long he's been writing. I've been writing for 10 years, so do I have to wait until I'm 65 to write a book on writing? And so this is the thing, there will always be somebody who is in quotation marks better than you, or more experienced than you, but you are the one who is in your situation right now, and you need to share your journey, and you will help other people.
Well, I can't think of a better way to sum up this conversation than that.
Fantastic.
Of course, I could talk to you all day, as we've said before, but I think we'll leave it there, although I've already come up with like 3 other episode ideas. So
we'll do it again.
Have to discuss that later. But thank you so much for coming on. As always, so useful, so helpful. And I know everyone is going to love hearing from you. And hopefully we will see a huge uptick in nonfiction books after everyone listens.
Oh, I do hope so. And of course, I'm at thecreativepenn.com, pen with a double N, if anyone wants to come over. And if you have any questions, I'm always on Twitter at thecreativepenn.
Perfect. So do look Joanna up. She's so helpful and approachable. And also she has a lovely Patreon, so you can get in touch with her there, which is super fun also. Thank you so much for listening to the Secret Library podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this week's show. You can keep the conversation going by leaving a comment in the show notes at secretlibrarypodcast.com or visit us on Facebook at facebook.com/secretlibrarypodcast. You can also connect directly with me on Twitter or Instagram, where I'm Caro Donahue. That's at CaroDonahue. I look forward to chatting with you there. See you next week. Until then, happy writing.